Welcome back, family and friends. It's good to see you again for another Bedtime with Bernie. We're reading It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism by Senator Bernie Sanders. We last left off on page 28, where we were talking about Bernie Sanders and the heart attack that he had had while he was on the campaign. So let us continue. While we were uncertain about the future, one thing was clear. For me, after months of going nonstop, the campaign was at least temporarily on hold. I was heading home to Burlington to rest and recuperate, spend time with my family, and talk with close aides such as my campaign manager, Fayez Shakir. Media speculation about whether I would quit the race intensified with each passing day. Reporters were hanging out in front of the house, but that wasn't what I was thinking about. I was focused on getting stronger. Before my heart attack, walking several miles was not a problem. Now I was running out of breath after going a few blocks. The good news was that as the days passed, I could go farther and farther. While I was not 100%, the walks around our backyard were getting easier. I was coming back. Having never experienced a health emergency like this before, I didn't know how long it would take for me to feel like my old self, but I had a growing sense that I was going to get there. Jane and I talked a lot about whether we wanted to return to the campaign. We both agreed that we did, and when the time felt right, we called together a small group of family members and aides and began to chart our course going forward. The first real test would come on October 15th, when I was scheduled to participate in a CNN debate with other Democratic candidates. Some debates last an hour, some an hour and a half. But my luck, this was a long one, 2 hours. I was nervous about how I would do physically. The other candidates were kind, especially Kamala Harris, to whom I had not been all that close up to that point. Backstage, she was at my side asking, "Do you need to sit? Did you eat?" The expressions of concern from the other candidates included my fellow senators Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, and Cory Booker were genuine, and I truly appreciated them. But they also reminded me that this was a pivotal night when voters would be watching to see whether I could stand up for 2 hours and how I would perform when it came to answering questions about not just the issues, but my health. 2 hours on your feet speaking in front of millions of viewers is never an easy thing. In this instance, it was the most demanding task I had taken on since the heart attack. If I had been forced to walk off the stage because of fatigue, it's likely the campaign would have been over right there. I don't remember if I, quote, won the debate or not, but I did stay up on my feet, spoke more than most of the other candidates on stage, answered questions about everything from breaking up monopolies to protecting the Kurds in Syria, called Trump the most corrupt president in American history, and earned some generous rounds of applause. We were back. The debate was critical to renewing the campaign, but just as important was a call I got from Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who had not made an endorsement up to that point. Alexandria, who during her first year in Congress had become enormously popular with the progressive community and young people across the country, had been courted by several of the candidates. But she contacted me shortly before the debate to say that she had decided to endorse our campaign. Later, she explained, "For me, it wasn't even about helping the senator. It was a moment of clarity for me personally in saying, what role do I want to play? And I want to be part of a mass movement." It turned out that she was not alone in that view. Representative Ilhan Omar made a video in which she endorsed our campaign and announced Bernie Sanders isn't fighting to win just one presidential election. He's fighting for the soul of democracy. Representative Rashida Tlaib, I can't pronounce her last name, Tlaib, another member of the squad, as Ocasio-Cortez had dubbed the four young progressive congresswomen elected in 2018, called and said she wanted to make her endorsement at a rally in her hometown in Detroit. It was just remarkable. All of these young members of Congress to whom I felt very close ideologically and personally were calling to say they wanted the campaign to continue and that they wanted to be a part of it. On the Saturday following the debate, we held a rally in Queens, New York, where I was joined by many longtime supporters, including campaign co-chairs Nina Turner, a former state senator from Ohio, and Carmen Yulin Cruz, the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico. Tiffany Caban, who would go on to be elected to the New York City Council, introduced Alexandria, who told the crowd, "I'm proud to say that the only reason I had any hope in launching a long shot campaign for Congress is because Bernie Sanders proved that you can run a grassroots campaign in America where we almost thought it was impossible." The crowd of 27,000, the largest of the campaign to that point, welcomed me warmly when I took the stage. I knew that we had passed the test. And let me say this, it was an indescribable feeling to stand on stage and look out as far as the eye could see at a crowd of supporters from every conceivable background who had come out that fall day to carry forward a campaign for fundamental change. I thought about the beauty of our country and the potential of our movement to realize all of its promise. During that speech, I introduced a slogan developed by Jeff Weaver, a fellow Vermonter who had been working with me on campaigns for decades, that perfectly encapsulated what our run was all about. Not me, us. We were not merely making a race for the presidency. We were building a movement to transform the politics and the future of the United States. This was America at its best, and it created in me an incredible sense of optimism about what could be accomplished by a campaign that, in many senses, was only beginning to hit its stride. I did not shy away from talking about the heart attack. There's no question that I and my family have faced adversity over these last few weeks. I told the crowd, the untold story is that people everywhere in this country, in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, are facing their own adversities. That was the message I could take back on the road. Confronting the status quo. We worked harder than ever, traveling to more states, holding more rallies and town meetings, issuing more position papers, going deeper in our discussions of the issues. Our poll numbers started ticking upwards. After months of trailing Joe Biden, sometimes by double digits, a January national poll from CNN put me in first place. And then an NBC poll did the same. But polls are one thing, winning actual votes is another. In Iowa, where the process began, the caucuses were a debacle. The state party screwed up the vote count so badly that it took days to get a result. And when it was finally came, I had won the most votes thanks to overwhelming support from young people and rural communities where I had held all those town meetings. A week later, we won New Hampshire, beating 19 other candidates and carrying 7 of the state's 10 counties. I was now the clear front runner. The momentum we were building terrified the defenders of status quo politics in the upper echelons of the Democratic Party and in the media. An Associated Press report from January 8, 2020 warned fears of Sanders' win are growing among Democratic establishment. As our campaign went from strength to strength, the outcry from the establishment grew louder. A front page story in the New York Times on February 13th featured the headlines, "Sanders on the rise, anxiety deepens among centrists." It reported that within the Democratic establishment, the results have deepened a mood of anxiety and frustration. The article also mentioned growing enthusiasm on the part of party leaders for Michael Bloomberg, a multi-billionaire who was spending hundreds of millions on TV ads to win the nomination. While Bloomberg and his supporters were claiming that I would ruin the party's chances in November, polls consistently showed me leading Trump. Indeed, around the same time AP report was published, a CNN poll had me 7 points ahead of the incumbent. What was the real source of that anxiety and frustration on the part of the establishment Democrats? Was it because our campaign couldn't beat Trump? Of course not. Polls showed that we were beating him by a wider margin than any other candidate. Was it that our ideals were unpopular? No, working families across the country were reacting enthusiastically to our messages on the economy, healthcare, climate, social, and racial issues, and we were bringing far more people out to our events than any other candidate. Were the insiders sincerely concerned that our campaign would divide and weaken the party? Not if they were paying attention to what was happening in the caucus and primary states. Our campaign was bringing millions of people from all backgrounds, especially young people, the future of the party and the country, into the political process. Let's be honest. What the establishment was anxious about was the fact that we were beginning to transform the Democratic Party from an election machine dominated by wealthy campaign contributors and corporate interests into a multi-racial, multi-ethnic, urban, and rural movement of the working class. What frustrated the insiders was the prospect that they and their wealthy friends, the lobbyists and the consultants, were losing control of a party they thought of as their personal possession. It became clear to me that what the struggle really came down to was a question of whether the Democratic establishment was prepared to stop coddling corporate power and begin to challenge it as Franklin Roosevelt had done in the New Deal era, or whether they would continue working the cocktail party circuit for donations from billionaire investors and corporate CEOs. In other words, our campaign threatened a very cozy status quo, which answered that threat with a cry of anybody but Bernie. After I won a landslide victory in the critical Nevada caucuses with a 2-1 lead over the next closest contender, Joe Biden, and began to show strength in states from California to Maine, US Today opinion piece declared, moderate Democrats say have a duty to consider Sanders. He has a clear path to beating Trump. Voters agreed. A national Reuters Ipsos poll from late February found that Democratic and independent voters felt I would be the strongest Democratic contender in a head-to-head race with the president. Unfortunately, our surging momentum rattled the establishment even more. It was clear they were preparing to throw everything they could against us. In the final debate before the February 29th primary in South Carolina, a southern state where Biden had strong support and where he could prevail with relatively ease, I wanted to talk about taxing billionaires, ending student debt, and caring for the 87 million Americans who had no health insurance or were underinsured as the coronavirus pandemic began to take hold. My rivals had other ideas. Before the first round of questioning was done, Mike Bloomberg was claiming that Russian President Vladimir Putin wanted me as the nominee against Trump, so you will lose to him. Former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg warned, if you think the last 4 years have been chaotic, divisive, toxic, exhausting, imagine spending the better part of 2020 with Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. The moderators egged them on, literally encouraging the other candidates to attack as unworkable the proposal I had made for implementing Medicare for all, a system similar to those of other Western democracies. It was an absurd and unsettling night. Issues were discarded as the other candidates kept pushing the line that nominating me would destroy Democratic chances in November. Bernie will lose to Donald Trump, declared Bloomberg. The House and the Senate and some of the state houses will all go red. And then, between gerrymandering and appointed judges for the next 20 or 30 years, we are going to live with this catastrophe. When moderator Nora O'Donnell called on me to respond, I couldn't resist observing. Mayor Bloomberg has a solid and strong, enthusiastic base of support. The problem is they're all billionaires. I could have gone on pointing out that Bloomberg had no clue about how to build a genuine grassroots campaign and was only trying to buy the nomination with TV ads. But I quickly got to the point of saying, of the last 50 polls that have been done nationally, Mr. Bloomberg, I beat Trump 47 of those 50 times. I knew I was right. But I also knew that this wasn't an argument about electability. This was a fight between a new vision of politics and the status quo vision that had for decades thwarted progress in the party and the country. As Super Tuesday voting on March 3rd approached, the status quo made its move. This was very probably its last chance to stop us. Super Tuesday was the most important election day in the race for the Democratic nomination. 14 states from Maine to California were holding their primaries and caucuses, and the candidate who did well on that day, with over 1/3 of the pledged delegates at stake, could be well positioned to win the nomination. The good news for us is that polling showed we were winning many of the Super Tuesday states, including the two that would choose the largest number of delegates, California and Texas. The bad news was for us is that the establishment fully understood the threat they face, and it was prepared to do everything in its power to prevent us from prevailing. It wasn't a secret. Time magazine reported on February 27th that big money Democrat donors are trying to stop Bernie Sanders, while a March 2nd New York Times headline announced Democratic leaders willing to risk party damage to stop Bernie Sanders. On the eve of Super Tuesday, the establishment struck. Despite having raised tens of millions of dollars and having run campaigns that were still seen in many circles as credible, two of the leading moderate Democrats in the race, Pete Buttigieg and Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, abruptly canceled their candidacy and endorsed Biden. Both flew to Texas, the most hotly contested of primary states, to appear with former vice president. They were joined by other former candidate, Texas Beto O'Rourke, in a highly choreographed show of support. The establishment had succeeded in uniting in support of Biden, the candidates who had been dividing up the moderate vote. Meanwhile, the liberal and progressive vote continued to be divided between Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and myself, despite poor showings in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. Warren chose to stay in the race. I was closer to her on the issues than any other candidate, but at a point where her endorsement could have made been significant in a number of Super Tuesday states, she chose not to give it. Even as the centrist vote coalesced around Biden and the progressive and liberal vote was divided, our campaign still won California, Colorado, Utah, and Vermont on Super Tuesday. But Biden beat us in Texas by around 60,000 votes. That narrow win, along with solid victories in Virginia, Massachusetts, and Minnesota, gave the former vice president a huge boost. Our campaign, which days earlier had been expected to win the most delegates on Super Tuesday, was suddenly trailing. Biden had the lead and the momentum. Warren left the race a few days later, and with the exit of Bloomberg, what had been a 23 candidate contest was down to two-man race between Biden and me. We soldiered on through the next round of primaries and won in places such as North Dakota, but Biden was taking the big states, and the onset of COVID-19 made it impossible for us to hold the rallies and mount the door-to-door campaigns that were needed to have a chance in states I had won in 2016, such as Michigan and Washington and Wisconsin. After a loss in the Wisconsin primary on April 7th, we reached the decision that it was time to suspend our campaign. Needless to say, it was difficult to end a campaign that has been sustained by thousands of active volunteers, attracted the support of millions of voters, and even more difficult when the campaign has become a movement that has roused a sense of possibility about finally addressing the most challenging issues facing the nation. I would be less than honest if I failed to acknowledge that many of my staffers wanted to carry on, arguing that even if we could not win, we should take the message forward. But to my mind, as painful as the decision was, there did not appear to be any other option. As I said to our supporters when we suspended our efforts, if I believed we had a feasible path to the nomination, I would certainly continue the campaign, but it's just not there. Ending a campaign, carrying forward a movement. My decision to suspend our campaign was about something greater than the primary fight in which I had been involved. I could not justify making a futile effort that might have undermined the united front we needed to build in order to defeat Trump. I had started my 2020 campaign with a determination to defeat the most dangerous president in the modern history of the country, and I intended to do everything I could to boot Donald Trump out of office. I concluded that we might as well get started on that effort as soon as possible. So it was that on the morning of April 8th, 2020, I began the live stream broadcast from my home. No, it was not a typical concession speech because ours had not been a typical campaign. I, of course, congratulated Joe Biden as a very decent man who I will work with to move our progressive ideas forward. I spoke of how I would work with him to forge a progressive platform and how together, standing united, we would defeat Donald Trump. But my main message had to do with what we had accomplished with a campaign that really meant it when we said, not me, us. I remember the millions of Americans who watched the live stream that we had built, an unprecedented grassroots political campaign that had a profound impact on changing our nation. Together, we have transformed American consciousness as to what kind of nation we can become and have taken the country a major step forward in the never-ending struggle for economic justice, social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. I said before, recalling a quote from Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. What Mandela meant, and what I strongly believe, is that the greatest obstacle to reach social change has everything to do with the power of the corporate and political establishment to limit our vision as to what is possible and what we are entitled to as human beings. If we don't believe that we are entitled to healthcare as a human right, we will never achieve universal healthcare. If we don't believe that we are entitled to decent wages and working conditions, millions of us will continue to live in poverty. If we don't believe that we're entitled to all the education we require to fulfill our dreams, many of us will leave schools saddled with huge debt and never get the education we need. If we don't believe that we're entitled to live in a world that has a clean environment and is not ravaged by climate change, we will continue to see more drought, floods, rising sea levels, and an increasingly inhabitable planet. While we did not win the nomination, I said, we changed the public consciousness. It was not long ago that people considered our ideas radical and fringe. I explained today they are mainstream ideas and many of them are already being implemented in cities and states across the country. That is what we've accomplished together. If that does not sound quite like the language of defeat, it's because I believe the setback we suffered in 2020 was only temporary. Why was I so confident? because I said, not only are we winning the struggle ideologically, but we are also winning generationally. The future of our country rests with young people. And in state after state, after we won, whether we lost the Democratic primary caucuses, we received a significant majority of the votes, sometimes an overwhelming majority, from people not only 30 years of age and under, but 50 years of age or younger. In other words, the future of this country is with our ideas. That ends our reading for tonight. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.